extraordinarily hard over the last 19 months. They've stood shoulder together in a time which can really only be described as one of the most turbulent in recent history. I think South Australia is now enjoying a very enviable status, and I'm very grateful to the people of South Australia for the hard work that they have put in. I'm asking them to continue to work hard to make sure that we can get to as normal a Christmas as possible, but there's got to be some reward for the sacrifices that individuals and businesses have made, and today it's with great pride that I announce our COVID-ready plan for South Australia. From November the 23rd, we will be removing our border restrictions for those people who are double vaccinated to come into South Australia. From November the 23rd, we will be reducing the time that international arrivals need to be in quarantine from 14 days down to 7. On the 23rd of November, we will also be increasing the cap for home gatherings from 20 to 30, but other arrangements will need to stay in place for the foreseeable future. We then move to our next milestone when we get 90% of South Australians 12 and over double vaccinated. We will be able to remove the quarantine arrangement for those people coming in from overseas that are double vaccinated, and we will remove the vast majority of the other restrictions in South Australia. Now, we still need to keep, of course, some controls in place. We're still getting some final information in terms of modelling, but we intend to remove most of those restrictions once we get to 90% double vaccinated, 12 and over, which I'm hopeful that we will achieve before Christmas this year. But, as I said, some restrictions will need to remain in place, and we certainly will need to have them in place for some COVID management events. So the race is on in South Australia. We need as many people to get vaccinated as quickly as possible so that we can enjoy as normal a Christmas as possible during this pandemic. Again, I want to thank all South Australians for their extraordinary efforts over the last 19 months. We're the envy of the world, but as we know, we cannot keep the Delta variant out forever. We do need to make sure that we can be COVID ready, and that's why in recent weeks we've announced $123 million worth of initiatives to make sure we are COVID ready when those border restrictions ease. This is hundreds of additional bed capacity in our hospital system. It means that we are employing all of the graduating nurses this year, 1,200 graduating nurses. It means a very much a turbocharging of the out-of-hospital care packages that we offer. So we're doing everything we can, but those border restrictions will be eased from the 23rd of November. I know this will be a huge relief for so many South Australians who are wanting to get back to a sense of normality as quickly as possible.
Premier, the 23rd of November is a week earlier than I thought. We were on track to hit 80% double dosed. Why is that? Have we sped up? Or?
So the information that we have received is that we will hit that 80% double vaccinated for those 16 and over. Now, there are some jurisdictions that are moving to 12 and over, but the Doherty model was always very clear in South Australia that we would be sticking to that Doherty model, 16 and over. And I think that there will be a big surge now in the vaccination rate. I think people in South Australia have always done the right thing. They've observed those restrictions we put in place. Most important, they've listened to the health experts. The health experts are now telling us that vaccination is our pathway out. We believe we'll get to that 80% double vaccinated 16 and over by the 23rd of November.
Will that be equity across LGA's vaccination rate, or will that be the state average?
Yeah, we're certainly looking very closely at that. There are some that are lagging behind. There's some reasons for that. We're redoubling our efforts in all of those areas. We want to see equity right across the system in South Australia, but we also want there to be a fairness for those people who have done the right thing. So our strong message to everyone in South Australia is let's get to that 80% double vaccinated 16 and over for the 23rd of November, and then let's get to the 90% double vaccinated for those 12 and over as quickly as possible. Now, the people of South Australia have been extraordinary right throughout this pandemic. I think we'll hit that 90% double vaccinated 12 and over by the end of this year. Won't that be wonderful?
So just to clarify, Premier, though, the 23rd of November, are you expecting to have 80% of South Australians vaccinated, or are you expecting, is that going to be equity across the LGAs or not?
So I think I've said right from day one, we don't have to have a minimum standard of 80%, but we don't want some lagging at 20% and others at 99%.
So all LGAs will be 80%, is that right?
No, I just answered that really only about 1 second ago, actually. The reality is it's not a minimum standard. It's a standard across the state, but of course we don't want a situation where you have some LGAs at 20% and others at 99%. Exactly what that really is as a minimum standard we will determine. But as I said, I have every confidence in SA Health to be able to identify those LGAs, those vulnerable communities, and make sure we're putting in an extra special effort. But the situation in South Australia is pretty clear. We do not make it mandatory for all of our citizens. There is some mandatory in certain cohorts, but it's not mandatory for all South Australians, and that's why we are out there actively campaigning to get as many people vaccinated as possible.
Why is there a discrepancy?
When you, what happens if there is an outbreak of COVID between, 80% and 90%, or in, around that time, that what happens to people that are subject to those outbreaks?
I think what I'm hearing is, what happens if somebody is infected during that between 80 and 90? Yes. Well, there definitely will be cases. I mean, look, if we're truthful about it, there have been dozens of cases in South Australia over the last couple of months. Now, we've been fortunate. They haven't led to widespread community transmission, and that's because of the great work of all South Australians, and for that, I'm very, very grateful. But as soon as we lift those border restrictions, we will have cases that come into South Australia. Now, we've said from day one, we still need to keep what we call test, trace, isolate and quarantine protocols in place. So if somebody does become infected, they will need to go into isolation, and so will their close contacts, because we don't want this just to wash through. We won't be able to keep it out, but we don't want to accelerate it. So that TTIQ will need to remain in place for as long as possible. And the reason for that is the longer we go, the higher the vaccination rate, which is the higher level of protection for our state overall. It means that we won't have to be punishing statewide restrictions back in place.
Are you concerned about areas in like the northern suburbs, obviously, is what Gemma was alluding to, that might be well below that 80% mark, that they'll be vulnerable if we do have an outbreak?
Well, I think I've answered that. I really do think I've answered. I can go through the same.
So are you concerned though? Because
absolutely, but I also said I have every confidence that SA Health will be able to address those issues. There's no minimum standard of getting to 80, and I've made that clear since day one.
And Premier, didn't you say previously that you would open the borders once there was that equity vaccination across South Australia?
What I said from day one is that we need to get to 80% double vaccinated for those 16 and over. We wouldn't be making it mandatory in South Australia, but there does need to be equity. We don't want 20s and 99s. But we have never said that there will be a minimum requirement of 80, because that would actually mean an average of probably 97, 98. Now, that was not going to work. So I think we've been pretty clear on this since day one.
And if a South Australian is fully vaccinated and they do come into contact with a positive case, what will be the situation? Will they have to quarantine for 14 days, or will there be a difference because they're fully vaccinated?
Look, in the early days, we still will be requiring people to go into that isolation period. We're really wanting to, if you like, delay the seeding of the Delta variant in South Australia for as long as possible, because we know that every day that goes past, we increase our vaccination rate in South Australia, and that reduces the risk. So I'm very pleased with the way it's going in South Australia at the moment. Again, last week, more than 100,000 doses administered. I think that's now 3 or 4 weeks in a row where we've had over 100,000 doses administered. That's fantastic. But now I'm asking South Australians to continue to work with SA Health, South Australia Police, the Government of South Australia, and get that vaccination. We've tried to make it as easy as possible for everybody to go and get themselves vaccinated. Now you've got every incentive in the world, because when we get to that 90% double vaccinated 12 and over, so many of those restrictions that have been annoying but very important from a public health perspective, so many of those will be able to be removed safely.
You say the modelling or the forecasting showing at 90% will be before Christmas. Do you actually have a specific date on when you anticipate that to come into effect?
And in terms of the 23rd of November, is that flexible? Could that be brought forward or back depending on when we hit
No,
that 80%?
look, I understand the question. The reality is we're wanting to give certainty today. So we have left this to much closer to the date than some other states have. They may choose to bring theirs forward. We thought it was more important to give a date that we were firm on, and that date is now the 23rd of November.
I mean, we are one of the only jurisdictions to invite COVID in, essentially. Do you think our population is ready for that, and do you think our health system is ready for that?
Absolutely. So in recent weeks, we've announced a COVID ready package of $123 million. This is making sure that we have that extra bed capacity in our hospitals, but also taking on all the graduating nurses this year, plus a fairly large program for out-of-hospital care. So I'm quite convinced we've taken all the necessary steps. It's now over to the people of South Australia to continue their great work and make sure that we hit those vaccination rates that we need in South Australia. But I don't have much doubt about that. South Australians have responded to the call from SA Health since day one. First of all, with getting themselves tested. Secondly, of course, with QR code check-in, and now, of course, with the vaccination rate. And I'm very satisfied with the way that South Australians have rolled out their sleeves and had that vaccination. We had another very good week last week, and I expect that to continue to be very good rates all the way through to the 23rd of November and beyond, because the incentive is there now for all South Australians as we get closer to the 90% double vaccinated for those 12 and over, that we can start to remove those restrictions that really have been necessary but annoying. And I just want to enjoy as normal a Christmas as possible here in our state. Andrea?
Why has the South Australian government changed its mind on the 7 days quarantine for international arrivals? When I asked you a couple of weeks ago, you said that we wouldn't be adopting that from the federal government. We'd be sticking with 14 days for international arrivals. What's changed?
No, in fact, if you go back to what we said at that time, we said whilst we were signed up to it at the national level, we didn't want to put a date on it, and we just wanted to get further information regarding where we were in terms of our vaccination rate. So we've always in South Australia been signed up to that national cabinet framework. The reality is, though, within that we make some decisions around dates. Today we're putting the date of the 23rd of November, and I think this is going to be huge relief to some people who have been stranded in the state or overseas, that they'll be able to come back, first of all, with no quarantine here for people coming back from interstate, with very a few provisos around that you'll see on that form. So if they're coming from an LGA which has community transmission and low vaccination rate, then they'll still need to do some quarantine. But beyond that, I think we can really start to enjoy some real freedom and mobility that we've been lacking for such a long period of time.
Also, why is there a discrepancy? So for the 80% target, it's over 16. For the 90% target, it's more ambitious. It's over the age of 12. Why has that shifted?
Well, because of course we're now open to those over the age of 12, so they've got a lot more time. And look, it's quite possible that the National Cabinet will receive advice when it next meets, which I think is this Friday, that we will be opening up for those 5 to 11. So as we receive that advice, we change and update our framework, and that's what we've done with the 12 and over. The original modelling that came to National Cabinet was at a time when we only had those 16 and over being eligible for vaccination in Australia, and so since that's been changed, we can update that model going forward.
Why is stand-up drinking only allowed after we get to 90% double dose 12 and over?
Well, as I said, we're still getting some final modelling in terms of what those public health social measures should be. When we look at other states, there will be sort of variances around it. Look, I don't want to have any restriction in place for one day longer than we need to, and the best way to have everything removed, quite frankly, is to get to that 90% double vaccination for those 12 and over, and we do that as quickly as possible. And as we increase that vaccination rate, we reduce that risk, and it opens up a world of possibilities. But when we're trying to forecast something out for the end of the year, it's naturally more prudent. But I'm hopeful that we can continue to work like we have over the last 19 months in a very positive way.
What if a venue decides to have just fully vaccinated people at that venue? Does that change those sort of settings?
Yeah, so we'll sit down and work with the industry over the coming weeks as to exactly what that 90% plus rate looks like. But I'm very hopeful we'll get there very soon, and we'll work with the industry on exactly how that's going.
What does the updated modelling show in terms of cases?
Will we get a look at the modelling, Premier?
So the modelling is in sort of multiple parts. So part of it was received from the Doherty Institute to the National Cabinet. We've had some that's come in directly to us. We're still receiving some which is coming to us, but we didn't want to delay this announcement today. But I think the people of South Australia are keen to see some of that modelling, so I'm sure that's something that SAL will consider in the coming weeks.
And
make
can you
available.
explain the quarantine requirements that will be for those people you mentioned that will be coming from LGO with either low vaccination rates or COVID transmission?
So it needs to be both. So if they are coming from an LGA which has community transmission and a rate below 90%, there will be a requirement for testing and symptom declaration, and below 80% there will need to be quarantine. But I expect that all of the LGAs by the 23rd of November will be up above that 80%, because we're talking about states with community transmission being New South Wales, Victoria, and also, of course, the ACT. I think all of the areas within the ACT are already above the 80%. I think the vast majority in New South Wales and Victoria already are, because, of course, they've had the COVID Delta strain through their community, so they do have naturally higher vaccination rates than the rest of the country, like Queensland, Western Australia, South Australia, and Tasmania.
And will that be just a quarantine until they get a negative test result?
So between 80 and 90 is test, quarantine until a negative result, and then some ongoing testing. But below 80% will still be 14 days of quarantine at this stage.
Does the new modelling you have show an updated forecast about how many cases we can expect here when we open the borders?
Well, of course, there is some information which looks at a range of issues to do with hospitalisation, ICU, ventilator, but all of that has been taken into account. Was really what informed us to make sure that we could put the COVID-ready response into place. And so that's what we were asked to do. I think that what we've provided with a $123 million COVID-ready package is well above what the model is telling, but that moves depending on what that vaccination rate is, and of course what happens in other jurisdictions, because ultimately it'll be coming into South Australia. The crucial thing that the model deals with is how long we can keep optimal test, trace, isolate and quarantine arrangements in place, because that really slows that spread through to South Australia. But we cannot keep COVID out of South Australia. What we want to do, though, is to be as ready as possible, as vaccinated as possible, and making sure that we've got those resources in place across our health system.
That initial figure was originally around 4,000 cases, I understand. Are we still preparing for a surge of around 4,000 cases, or has that gone up or down?
So it moves depending on that optimal or partial TTIQ, but I'm very happy for Professor Sperry to answer a more technical question.
Will you make that modelling public?
Yes, so as I said, there's still modelling coming in. We'll probably have to put it in some form of consolidated arrangement, but we are keen to share with the people of South Australia exactly and precisely what is likely to occur in South Australia.
Premier, can I just ask you, in terms of moving forward, once we get to these magic dates and all of this hope that you're giving us, does that mean that the emergency declaration that we're now living in, with the Commissioner as our state coordinator, when do you anticipate that to come to an end?
Look, I haven't got a date for you, but as you can see, we're moving. If you look at our emergency, it's a little bit technical, but if you look at the Emergency Management Act, there are two components to it. One is response, and the second one is recovery. And so I think we are coming towards the end of the response, and we're moving into that recovery phase. But exactly what that date will be, I don't have for you today.
Do you want that to happen sooner rather than later now, given all of these new changes that are coming into effect?
All I can say is that we have been delighted with the response of South Australians since day one, in particular with the way that they've lined up to have this vaccination. Quite frankly, if you had have told me that we would be getting to 80% double vaccinated, 16 and over, by the 23rd of November 3 months ago, I would have said, you're dreaming. The reality is South Australia has again hit it out of the ballpark, and I have every expectation that's going to continue into the
Questions for the Premier, thank you guys.
Are you open to vaccine mandates for events like the Adelaide Festival, as the organisers would like?
So we would really leave, look, can I just say, in terms of mandatory vaccination, we have avoided it here in South Australia outside of a National Cabinet situation or specific health advice. Now, I haven't received any specific health advice with regards to the Adelaide Festival. I note recently that WOMAD has said, well, we only want it to be for people that are double vaccinated. If you think about why they would do this, there are some people who don't want to be vaccinated, but there's a very large proportion of South Australians who now do want to be vaccinated because they want to be safe, and so they want to go to events which are COVID safe, and so that's the decision that those organisers have taken. So, but overall in South Australia we've been careful to follow that national framework unless we receive specific advice. And then, of course, if that advice is received, we'll move on that.
And you'll only be allowed to enter a nightclub or stand up with a drink if you are vaccinated. How is that going to be policed?
Well, as I said about 4 or 5 minutes ago, we'll sit down with the industry exactly how the resourcing of that will work. But we're still waiting on that final modelling to come in with regards to what we call public health social measures, so that 90% and above. But we have set those for the 80% double vaccinated, 16 and above, which comes into effect on the 23rd of November.
Nick Reid yesterday said that the COVID reading plan wouldn't be released until the final delegative data was in. Have you changed your mind overnight, or how's that?
No. Look, the reality is we have been, I think it's pretty common knowledge, we've been receiving a lot of information from Doherty. There was a major presentation which was held last week. A lot of that data needs to be gone through, but at the COVID Ready Committee meeting this morning, people were very happy to move with what's been announced. Look, we could have probably waited for what we were going to announce for the 90% double vaccinated 12 and above until later in the month. But I think people want to know in the first instance when the state borders are going to be removed, and we're very happy to announce that's on the 23rd. So hand over now to Professor Sperry, who might give us some answer to Andrea's question before.
Thank you very much and good afternoon. And it is a wonderful day to be able to say that we can lift those borders with the eastern states. And personally, I'm thrilled because I have a daughter in the ACT, and she'll be watching this and she'll be knowing that she can come home at Christmas. But we've only been able to do this through the hard work of South Australians, and that's because you've all gone out and got vaccinated. Now, this can be a bit of a scary time for many of us because we haven't had COVID here in our state. We've had exposure sites, but we've been able to get on top of any of the cases that we've had. And so I can understand there's going to be a level of anxiety out there, particularly in those people that haven't got vaccinated yet. So when you think about the 23rd of November, and again, we look very closely at what this will mean, it gives us 4 weeks from today. So if you haven't got vaccinated, you still have time. If you go and get your Pfizer this week, you still have 3 weeks to get your second dose. If you go and get your Moderna today, you'll have your second dose in 4 weeks. And so that will be the date that we open the borders. Now, just a little bit more on how we're intending to open the borders so that try to allay the anxiety out there for South Australians. And we're going to do it in a gradual way. And it is only allowing people in that are fully vaccinated, so double vaccinated. And interestingly, and just to make the point, this includes all states and territories. So if you're in WA at the moment and you want to come to South Australia, after that date, you will have to be doubly vaccinated. Again, the same for NT, Queensland and Tasmania. So that's important for everybody to appreciate. Now, in terms of looking at the eastern states, Victoria, New South Wales and the ACT, we could look and say, where are some hot spots? Let's have a look at the numbers. But what we've decided to do is look at their vaccination rates. And we have vaccination rates for all of the LGAs, and those states have very, very high vaccination rates. There are a handful of states, a handful of LGAs who still have rather lower vaccination rates, so less than the 80%. So there will be a small number of jurisdictions where people will need to do quarantine. Now, in terms of those other LGAs with higher vaccination rates, the plan is to have everybody who comes into South Australia enter through our portal. So we won't be using the cross-border platform, we'll be using our SA Health portal. And we have a very good technology here in South Australia, and it's around our home quarantine solution app. Now, it's a very useful app because it helps people do home quarantine, but it also pushes out a symptom checker, and it also tells you on the app where you can get tested in South Australia. So for those people coming from LGAs where there's 90% of their population vaccinated, they will have to do a daily symptom check using that app, and it will also allow them to understand how we use the QR check-in in South Australia. LGAs with a population vaccination rate of between 80 and 90% fully vaccinated come into our state, and they will use the same app to do a daily symptom check, but in addition we'll have them doing one test and isolate until we get that result. Now, in addition to having people who are doubly vaccinated, like Tasmania and Queensland, we will also require a negative test within the 3 days before coming to our state. So just to explain to South Australians that yes, the border is opening, but we still have some checks and controls in place. We also have a very useful question here about what does contact tracing mean? Will we still need that? Absolutely. So the Doherty model showed that when we have vaccination of 80%, we still need to have very good contact tracing, and we still need to have the public health and social measures. So as you can see in our plan at 80%, we've still got our current public health and social measures, those current restrictions, and we will still need to do the contact tracing. And we will very likely continue to do that contact tracing right through into the future. And in fact, we have a lot of other infectious diseases that when we're not doing COVID, we also do contact tracing with. So people know with meningococcus, for example, if we have a case of that, we do contact tracing. So contact tracing is something that all communicable disease control branches do, and we will be continuing to do that for COVID. So one of the messages is for South Australians is you're still going to need to do the QR check-in, because that allows us to do very good contact tracing. And as the Premier said, having that more optimal form of contact tracing significantly reduces the risk of that disease taking off and getting an epidemic or an outbreak. So really just to put a little bit more detail around the expectations, particularly at above 80%, hopefully I've answered some of the questions that you've raised with the Premier.
Professor, as of yesterday, your department was saying we're going to hit 80% early December. What's changed since yesterday, and are you happy that we're opening up on November 23?
So it is difficult to predict exactly at what point we're going to hit the 80% mark. And if we haven't hit it by the 23rd of November, I'm sure that we will hit it within the week following. And so I don't think it's going to make very much difference. But what I think this does is gives a very strong message to people in South Australia that if you've been thinking and you've been hearing, oh, we're going to open the borders towards the end of the year or before Christmas, maybe I'll just wait till school's over, or maybe I'll just wait till December. This is a clear message that you don't have time to wait. We have our vaccination clinics up and running. You can walk in any time, you can get your vaccine. There are so many opportunities now. Of course, there's the Pfizer, but there's also Moderna at our pharmacies. And so there's a time for everybody to get on board. Now, I'm hoping with the roadmap as we've stepped it out, because it's actually up to South Australians to get above 90%. And if it's good enough for ACT and good enough for New South Wales, and it's going to be good enough for us here, the quicker we can get to that, the better, in terms of having good disease control, plus an ability, as the Premier said, to get life back a little bit more normal.
In regard to the modelling, the latest modelling, I asked the Premier about the expected case numbers. Initially, the 4,000 was flagged. Is that still your advice, or has that number gone up or down?
So that number of 4,000 really wasn't based on modelling, Andrea. What that was doing was having a look at the maximum number of cases, active cases in New South Wales and Victoria, and trying to work out when you have that number of active cases, how many ICU beds and how many ward admissions will you have. And so that was just trying to give us an estimate as we were planning for our hospital capacity. So we have more detailed Doherty modelling now. It uses the same model as the original Doherty model, but what it's done is put in South Australian data, our demographic data. We have a slightly older population. It also puts in our vaccination rates across all of the different age groups, and it also puts in our current transmission potential. Now, that's the most interesting part of this, because we can have a very accurate recording of our transmission potential, and it's made public. It's on the Common Operating Picture that the Commonwealth put out every week. and it takes into account our vaccination level, but it takes into account what we're doing in terms of our public health and social measures. So it is much more accurate. Now, I will be very happy to release that publicly when it's the right time, but it was very clear that we could move forward and we could have a date for our border opening at this particular point in time.
And does
Professor,
it
could I
give
please
you a
ask
figure
you-
in terms of the expected cases? Can we know that today?
No, I'm not going to provide you with an exact figure. I haven't got the report in front of me.
Is it higher or lower than 4,000
Well,
cases?
I'm not going to really answer that question because that wasn't based on modelling.
Professor-
And when we release the modelling, then it will be very clear to people.
Professor, could I just ask you, did you support the plan as presented today, and what happened to the sort of 3-month buffer or a time frame to allow Delta to come into the state and for us to see how our hospital system will cope? Why have we then diverted to 90% now vaccination sometime before Christmas?
I think the reason is because South Australians have got vaccinated so quickly. And the same as the Premier, I would have a month or so back, would have been very surprised to know that we would have got such high vaccination rates so quickly. And I think now that we've seen what other states can do in terms of getting up to above 90%, we feel more confident that we can do that as a state.
So, are you ruling out, is this the end of lockdowns? Is this the end of all these draconian restrictions now, in your expert view?
I think what was very clear from the original majority modelling is that when you get to 80% vaccination, you don't need to have the border controls and we won't need to have state-wide lockdowns. We will still need to do the contact tracing, so it's absolutely important if you have any symptoms whatsoever, we're still going to need to have people getting tested. And in fact, we've totally ramped up SA pathology so that when we're getting cases, everybody can go and get themselves tested. Our contact tracing team have been told you're not going to have much of time off over Christmas up this year, unfortunately, because we're going to be working very hard, because that's also part of keeping everybody safe here in our state. And we still have the public health and social measures that we have today. So that's including wearing masks in public spaces, and it also includes having the restrictions on the standing consumption and the dancing and such like. But what we've flagged in this plan is that we will be able to get there, but it will be when we have the vast majority of people in our state vaccinated.
Will the Royal Adelaide Hospital still be the dedicated hospital for COVID positive patients, or under this plan, or will other hospitals start accepting COVID positive
So
patients?
when we have more COVID in our state, you'll have to have other hospitals accepting COVID patients. But the one thing about the Royal Adelaide Hospital, it is built in a way, it is brilliant for infection control because you can close off wards and the ventilation is fantastic. So that will definitely do all of the heavy lifting, particularly in terms of ICU patients. Women's and children's obviously will deal with children, and Flinders Medical Centre will deal with women who are pregnant. And then just as we're talking about women who are pregnant, I'm going to do a really big push, because if you are pregnant at the moment and you haven't been vaccinated, you really need to get on and get vaccinated, because you, if anybody, will get into trouble if you catch COVID.
International borders. Have a word to the Commissioner, please, if that's okay. Sorry, because everyone, I think, has to go to Parliament. Commissioner, did you think this day would come? Tell us how you're feeling now that you can sign off on this plan.
Oh, well, we're always going to get here. It's about timing. And as Professor Spurrier and the Premier have indicated, the take-up on vaccination has given us the opportunity to come forward and make these announcements today. We still have work to do. As a community and as a transition community, we still need to monitor closely exactly what's happening in South Australia. We are not at the 80% mark yet. We still have 4 weeks to go before we get there. So the decision has been made to retain these current level of restrictions whilst we are preparing the community for the introduction of COVID-19. I think it's a sensible decision, and it's one that sets us up for a very positive outcome in terms of managing COVID-19 coming into South Australia.
Can I just ask you?
Made for, the Premier's made his position clear on mandating vaccines, but with events like the festivals coming up and the organisers liking the idea, I think there's a case to be made for that to be applied, mandatory vaccines, or double dosing rather.
I think there will be some latitude for certain activities and events to make a decision, their own decision in relation to what patrons they're permitting entry to. Whether that be double vaccinated is a matter for them. I think with high levels of vaccination throughout the broader community, it certainly it's a consideration, but it may not be something that every major event wants to take on board. But I don't think we're there yet in terms of what mandated or fully vaccinated events looks like.
What about
Is there
venues or pubs?
mandated in nightclubs and pubs, essentially? You're not allowed to enter a nightclub or stand up with a drink without a vaccination. How? That's essentially mandatory vaccination, isn't it?
Well, I think we've said from the outset that nightclub activity is deemed to be one of those very high-risk activities, so it's about protecting the broader community. What the restrictions look like when we get to 90%, the commitment is that most restrictions will be removed, but we haven't yet determined exactly what those are and how they'll be applied. So it may not be the case that you can only enter a hotel and stand up and have a drink if you're double-vaxxed. But we're relying on the broader community, the wider community, to be fully vaccinated, so there's a broader protection for everybody. So we haven't landed on the specifics of post 90%, but the prospects are excellent. That there'll be very limited levels of restrictions, if any.
And the big in terms of that, though, in nightclubs, the requirement for vaccination, who will monitor that? The police or the nightclub?
There'll be some onus on the venue operators for those high-risk activities to put mechanisms in place to make sure that patrons have that double vax evidence. Obviously, the police, liquor licensing commissioner will have a role in this, public health have a role in this as well. So all of those sorts of things will be worked out over the next few weeks. And we've been learning as we go right through the course of the pandemic, and this is no different. We're entering another phase, and we're preparing for that now.
And Commissioner, if you come in from overseas,
we did give advice.
Yeah.
Sorry, Police Commissioner, can we just quickly run you on the Southeastern Freeway
I still
crash?
haven't had an update. I'm sorry.
but when it comes to someone coming from overseas and they come into a quarantine-free area like Sydney, and then they come straight into Adelaide, will they have to do the 7 days after?
Say that again.
So if they come in from overseas to a quarantine-free situation, when they then transit to Adelaide, is there still that 7 days of quarantine, even when our borders, state borders, are open?
So people who arrive in one of the eastern states from overseas, my understanding is the commitment from those jurisdictions is that there's no requirement for quarantine.
Yep.
I don't actually have the answer for you in terms of what they will be required to do when they arrive in South Australia, but the commitment at the moment is 7 days quarantine for international arrivals.
And
But once we
is
hit
that in a
90%.
hotel, or can that be
Depending on their circumstances, returning residents who have a place to home quarantine will be at home quarantine, but if you are a visitor, in all likelihood it will be any hotel. But
at their cost? They'll have to pay for
I
it.
don't have information. I don't think we've been charging too many people at all for hotel quarantine at this point in time, but once again, that's part of the work that has to be done between now and when we're at that position where we can welcome these people to South Australia.
But once we
Commissioner, can I just ask
90%.
you on QR codes? The professor raised the prospect that QR codes are here to stay, certainly for the foreseeable future. What's your view on that, or what's the Transition Committee's view on that?
Well, once again, right from the outset of the introduction of QR codes back in late 2020, the commitment was that they would only be in place whilst they were needed to manage COVID-19 in our community. We're at the point now where we're introducing COVID-19 into the community. We've dealt with the impact of the pandemic in other places, but the reality is we have not had the pandemic in South Australia. So we're now managing COVID-19 as safely as possible as it comes into South Australia. We're making sure the hospital system is able to cope with people who are COVID positive, who need health support. And part of that will be, as has been explained, the contact tracing, and QR codes are an important part of that. The commitment still remains, though, that when QR codes are no longer required for COVID-19, they will not be maintained. But we don't know when that's going to be, and I think it's reasonable to assume that for at least the next few months, we're still dealing with COVID-19.
So, Commissioner, just lastly on the Southeastern Freeway crash, I know you haven't been briefed, but we've been told that this driver was allegedly in breeches bail, was travelling 140 kilometres an hour through a missile, was speeding when they crashed. On the surface of it, how lucky is it that no one else was killed, and how much do you condemn this kind of behaviour?
Oh, look, we have no tolerance for anybody who misuses our roads in that sort of way. Excessive speed, my position in relation to extreme speed has been made very clear. Dangerous driving, including excessive speed, puts too many people's lives at risk. It's bad enough that you affect your own family when you're involved in a serious collision, but to take the risk of other people's lives who are simply using the roads is unforgivable. So I'm not commenting on the specific circumstances of this incident. I have not been briefed on it, but we have a low tolerance for people who drive dangerously and put others in the way of harm.
Thank you so much, Commissioner.